A landslide victory for Taiwan's pro-independence president, and a firm no to China's plan to take back the island it once controlled. So how might Beijing respond to Tsai Ing-Wen's emphatic win? And how far is the US prepared to go to defend its ally? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Taiwan has chosen to reject closer ties with China. President Tsai Ing-Wen, who favours independence, won the most votes in the island's history to secure a second term. It was just a year ago that her party suffered major losses in local elections. But months of anti-government protests in nearby Hong Kong boosted Tsai's campaign. Scenes of police cracking down on demonstrators appear to have galvanised younger voters in particular. Tsai warned that Taiwan's democratic rights must be preserved. China reiterated its long-held position that Taiwan will eventually be reunited with the mainland.
The Taiwanese people reject the one country, two systems model. We respect democracy and our sovereign rights. As the president of Taiwan, I must deal with the cross-strait relations according to the will of the people.
All right, let's get a sample of opinion then from people in Taiwan, Hong Kong and China.
I hope that both Taiwan and China will show goodwill. China should stop its military threats toward Taiwan.
The Taiwanese paid attention to Hong Kong and our situation here, and they are likely to be afraid that if they receive strong infiltration from the Communist Party, they will end up being no different from the people of Hong Kong today.
Taiwan is always part of China's territory. Many hope that the people across straits can coexist peacefully. This is a one China principle, and it's also what Chinese people have been longing for.
Well, Taiwan's status is bitterly disputed. It's officially known as the Republic of China and has been self-ruled since 1950. But China considers it part of its territory that must be reunited with the mainland by force if necessary. Only 15 countries around the world officially recognise Taiwan's government, and the United States is not one of them. But Washington is the island's most important ally and trading partner. Taiwan has its own military, its own currency, and a passport that's accepted in most countries. But crucially, it doesn't have a seat at the United Nations. All right, let's introduce our guests now. In Taipei, the Taiwanese capital, we have Joseph Cheng, a retired professor of political science at City University of Hong Kong. In Beijing, we have Andy Mock, a senior research fellow with the Centre for China and Globalization. In Singapore, Drew Thompson, a visiting senior research fellow with the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and a former US Defence Department official. Welcome to you all. But Joseph, can I come to you first? You are in the Taiwanese capital, but usually you're in Hong Kong, of course. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are about the influence the unrest over the last 8 months in Hong Kong have had on the politics of Taiwan.
On the basis of clear-cut public opinion surveys, in the beginning of 2019, Han Kuo-yu, the candidate of the Kuomintang, actually was leading. The tide began to turn in January last year when Xi Jinping announced that the one country, two systems model should apply to Taiwan. Then the gap rapidly narrowed, and before the political crisis in Hong Kong in June 2019, Tsai Ing-Wen was leading Han Kuo-yu by about 2% in the public opinion polls, which was actually not much. But then when the political crisis in Hong Kong began, the gap in popularity widened very much between the two candidates. And when the public opinion surveys closed 10 days before the actual election, in some opinion surveys, Tsai Ing-wen was leading by 30%. So it was obvious that pressure from China actually triggered Taiwan voters to demand the government to take a strong position against Beijing's pressure. And under such circumstances, they clearly opted for Tsai Ing-Wen. And actually, there was very little doubt about the election outcome concerning the presidential elections. One interesting point of observation was actually whether the governing Democratic Progressive Party could maintain its absolute majority in the legislature. And in fact, it managed to do so. It won 61 seats in the 113-seat legislature.
Sorry, Joseph, there's a bit of a delay on our line, but thank you very much for that. Let's go to Andy in Beijing. And Andy, a quite clear, unambiguous message then coming from the people of Taiwan: no to closer links with China, no to one country, two systems policy that have been advocated by President Xi.
Well, I'm not sure that we can make that tight a link between these two notions. Clearly, this election was a big win for Tsai Ing-Wen. I would question a little bit, at least, perhaps, that this is such a categorical rejection of eventual reunification with China. So this is one election. I would agree that what has happened in Hong Kong has had an influence on the electoral dynamics in Taiwan. But I would question, too, that what happened in Hong Kong versus the narrative in the mainstream Western media are two very separate things. And I think that what has taken hold and has had an impact on the election in Taiwan is the mainstream narrative that perhaps might not be completely accurate. So one way we could look at this was that this clearly was a big win for Tsai Ing-Wen. But does it really represent a repudiation of the Taiwanese people's desire for reunification?
Well, Andy,
I'm not entirely sure that it does.
Well, Andy, it's a record turnout. Something like 75% of the population turned out. She got something like 57% of the vote. And most analysts who watch events in Taiwan closely consider this a landslide and as I've already mentioned, an emphatic victory. But let me ask you this, Andy. It wasn't just the situation in Hong Kong, was it, that had perhaps a bearing on the way people in Taiwan voted? It was also the kind of, as the Taiwanese saw it, intimidatory measures taken by China in the run-up to the election. President Xi started the year by talking about this one country, two systems. There's been a lot of activity with regard to the ships, Chinese ships, which they've seen as being fairly threatening going along the Taiwan Straits. I mean, do you think China might have perhaps undertaken a policy that has eventually backfired?
I think that's difficult to say. I think clearly the PRC, the mainland, has an interest in the outcome of this election, and certainly I think would have preferred to have seen a different outcome. But I don't think it's correct to say that this was a referendum on reunification or not. So clearly there's a meaningful percentage of people in Taiwan that are not currently for reunification with Taiwan. And I think they have their reasons. But again, this is one election. It clearly was a big win for Tsai Ing-Wen and for the DPP. But whether or not this affects the ultimate trajectory of a reunification with the mainland, I would suggest remains to be seen.
All right. Let's go to Drew now in Singapore. And Drew, interesting. The US reaction to the election has come in the form of Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, talking about the strong partnership that the US and Taiwan enjoy, and applauds the President's commitment to maintaining cross-strait stability in the face of unrelenting pressure. So that's the initial response coming from the US to this victory. Is the US, under President Trump, continuing with this policy that it's had in place for some years now, one known as strategic ambiguity?
Well, I think U.S. policy is not going to shift and hasn't changed, and it wouldn't have changed even if there was a different outcome in this election. The U.S. Interest-based approach towards Taiwan is preserving its security, preserving its current way of life and its social systems and its economic systems and its very vibrant democracy. So U.S. support for Taiwan is enduring and has been strong regardless of which party was in power in Taipei. So in some ways, this is going to be a continuation, and we can expect as we move into Tsai Ing-Wen's second term that there'll be a deepening and strengthening of that bilateral relationship.
But Drew, under the Trump administration, there's been the approval of the sale of something like 66 F-16 fighter jets. This is something that the Obama administration and the Bush administration refused to approve because of the potential of provoking China. Yet the Trump administration has agreed to this sale of these jets. President Trump has also spoken, remember, in 2016 when he was president-elect, spoken directly on the phone to President Tsai, which is something that hadn't happened before. Is he moving away from that delicate balancing act that the US has maintained since 1979?
So one thing to remember, arms sales are not the only measure of U.S. support for Taiwan. It's a very important and very visible one. And yes, the Trump administration in under 3 years has sold more weaponry or has offered to sell more weaponry to Taiwan than either of the previous administrations did over 2 terms. So one issue, of course, though, is it's going to be impossible for Taiwan to continue to purchase arms from the United States at that same pace and rate. It's just unrealistic based on Taiwan's available defense resources. Taiwan is going to have to invest a lot of time and energy into now incorporating these newly acquired weapons into their inventory and learning how to operate them. So I think we may see a slowdown in arms sales, but that's not as much a political signal as just the reality of the ability of the Taiwan military to absorb these new systems. So the U.S. isn't going to move away from its current posture and position towards Taiwan. It's going to support Taiwan as a valuable and important partner in the region. It respects and appreciates its democracy. It's an important trading partner. I think it's the 11th largest trading partner of the United States. So I think the U.S. policy is going to be the same towards Taiwan. And of course, it's still based on very sound and very successful policies that are both law and practice.
Right. And Andy, in Beijing, I mean, is it fair to draw a parallel between what seem to be deteriorating relations between Taiwan and China and the US and China? Both relationships, both axes of cooperation, if you like, are at a particularly tense state.
Well, I would say that I think that this relationship between the U.S. and China and Taiwan is in flux. And part of it is I'm not entirely sure that this assertion that the U.S. will maintain its commitment to Taiwan will continue. Perhaps it will. But I think if we look at the broader direction of U.S. foreign policy, under this administration, there clearly has been a rethinking of some fundamental assumptions, relationships with allies, the American commitment, not just to Taiwan, but other parts of the world, to Europe, to the Kurds, for example. So I think there are a lot of questions raised in different capitals around the world. I would think even in Taipei as well, that how committed is the U.S. to its previous course of action. That being said, I think on the other side of this argument is that the current administration, I think, is very commercial-minded, perhaps a bit more transactional, putting less value in some of these intangibles like alliances, shared values, things like that, but much more perhaps transactional. So I think that is an important shift. The other is there clearly has been a sea change in the view towards China in that under the Obama administration, earlier administrations, there was this idea of engagement. And I think with President Trump, it really is more of a head-to-head kind of relationship. So there have been, I think, some major changes in how it affects Taiwan in the long run, I think is an enormous question mark and remains to be seen.
Joseph, coming to you, you're in the Taiwanese capital, and of course you normally reside in Hong Kong. Is this something that worries you, the apparent shift in the United States in terms of its engagement internationally, as Andy was pointing out? I mean, the Trump administration is spending a lot of its time, criticising multilateral institutions, but also withdrawing or at least announcing withdrawals from the international stage. Is that something that worries you in Hong Kong and, of course, in Taiwan?
Well, Donald Trump's foreign policy approach worries a lot of people in the international community. It is more transactional. It emphasizes on America comes first, and so on. But its emphasis, its priority attached to the Asia-Pacific region is very distinct. And I think people in Hong Kong, people in Taiwan are encouraged by the shifting public opinion trends in the United States that increasingly they would like to reassess the true nature of the Chinese Communist regime. I must respond to Andy's point about it is just another election. I think public opinion surveys in Taiwan, which is carefully conducted, has shown that in the past 2 decades, 60 to 70% of people in Taiwan would like very much to maintain just the status quo. And less than 5% of the people in Taiwan would opt for rapid reunification. Actually, in this election, all candidates rejected the one country, two systems model. So it is not just one election. It is a very clear-cut demonstration of political will on the part of the people in Taiwan.
But Joseph, Andy's contention is that eventually, at some point, Taiwan will be reabsorbed by, obviously, it's a far greater neighbour. But what I wanted to ask you is, how does President Tsai now proceed, given this mandate that she has? Is she going to retain the status quo, which is a fairly precarious balancing act? Or is she prepared to go further? Is she prepared to make a formal declaration of independence, for instance?
It is not expected that the Tsai Ing-Wen administration will initiate any serious departure from the present position. She has been careful not to provoke Beijing. She uses the term Republic of China Taiwan so as to try to maintain a balance and, again, not to provoke Beijing. There is a certain worry on the part of the people in Taiwan that perhaps the Xi Jinping administration may be too eager to accomplish the reunification within his tenure. And in that case, there may be a rapid escalation of tension across the Taiwan Straits. But certainly, people in Taiwan and the Tsai Ing-Wen administration will be more careful about exchanges with the Chinese authorities. And there has a recent law passed to highlight the threat from Beijing in terms of infiltrating the Taiwanese society, and a lot of preventive measures have been introduced in the recent statute.
All right. Andy, so the people of Taiwan do feel that there is a particularly a robust approach coming from President Xi in particular with regard to the potential reunification of Taiwan. President Xi himself has said that he is prepared to use force if necessary. Is he prepared to take action? Is he prepared to mount weapons and take Taiwan using military muscle?
Well, first I want to respond to Joseph's point. And I think I would agree with him, with you, Joseph, that this really then was not a referendum on reunification. Now, public opinion can and often does change. It can be very fickle. And even in places like the United States, there's enormous concern about outside, inappropriate interference in elections and the shaping of political will. So given the number of years, I think that Taiwan and the Taiwanese people have been subject to a one-sided narrative, I think, about what China's like, what the CPC is like, what reunification might be like. It's not surprising at all that there are significant numbers of people in Taiwan with a negative opinion on this question. But also, I think to look at it more optimistically, there also is the opportunity for change, just as we see around the world as more and more of the China story is better understood. Some of the concerns, even the paranoia about it, have gone down. So I think that that is an optimistic take. Force, I think, has never been ruled out, but it would be the last choice, I believe, for the PRC government. It's in no one's interest. It certainly would not be in the interest of the people of Taiwan or any other countries that chose to get involved. So, but I think given the situation, especially with the arms sales, the other support that the United States is providing to Taiwan, that having a military option on the table, I think, is necessary.
Right. Okay, Andy. And Drew, in Singapore, if the military option remains on the table, as Andy said, how far is the US, or how far would the US be prepared to defend its ally in this particular issue? And another sidebar, if I can, is asking you, how far is Taiwan seen as being part of a bigger deal, the trade deal between the US and China, as far as Washington's concerned?
I'll answer those two questions, but I want to respond to something that Andy had just mentioned.
Okay, but we haven't got a huge amount of time, Drew, so make it quick, please.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think one thing to point out is, in terms of public opinion in Taiwan, that the media on Taiwan is largely majority pro-China. So I would say that the Taiwanese public gets a very, very nuanced and very friendly view of China in their day-to-day consumption. So from that perspective, I think the Taiwanese people are making a very, very well-informed choice about the preference for China, for their relationship with the mainland. I also think it's really important to point out that this is not really reunification. That's a loaded term. The island of Taiwan and the people on Taiwan have never been a part of the People's Republic of China. So in terms of the U.S. commitment to Taiwan, the U.S. and Taiwan do not have a mutual defense treaty. That was abrogated after switching recognition in 1979. But there is the Taiwan Relations Act that requires the United States to maintain the military capability to defend Taiwan. And at the same time, while there isn't a military obligation under law, there is, more importantly, the U.S. position in the region that it has to protect. I mean, U.S. credibility would be on the line, and should the U.S. not come to Taiwan's defense, it would call into question its credibility with all of its other alliance partners: Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand.
Well, many of these
Thailand,
alliances are being
Philippines.
questioned, Drew. I mean, sorry to interrupt, but many of these long-standing alliances are being questioned under the Trump administration.
And I think if you look at what the United States government is doing, they are investing heavily in military capabilities. They are investing in economic development. They are putting a lot of diplomatic efforts into coordinating with allies and partners to strengthen. This is the whole Indo-Pacific strategy they're talking about. The U.S. government is increasingly focused on the region, and in an effort to bolster that credibility. So while it's being questioned, the government's responding, and it's spending a lot of money and capital into building up those partnerships and relationships so that its credibility isn't questioned anymore. But it's always going to be in China's interest to question that credibility, just as Andy has done in all of his comments about not being sure about Trump. The reality is the U.S. interests are in the region, and they're going to protect them, and Taiwan is a critical interest.
All right, we could talk forever, couldn't we? Thank you all very much, gentlemen. Joseph Cheng, normally in Hong Kong, but luckily for us, in the Taiwanese capital, Taipei. Thank you so much indeed. Andy Mok, really good to talk to you in the Chinese capital, Beijing, and Drew Thompson in Singapore. Thank you very much indeed. And as ever, thank you for watching the programme. You can see it again anytime you like by going to the website aljazeera.com. Should you want more discussion, there's always our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. At AJ Inside Story is our handle, and I'm at Martine Dennis. From me and the whole team here in Doha. It's bye for now.